In the view here, you see several things. You see some double point knitting needles, a Madeline doll, and several types of socks, as well as some straight needles. And I had recently uploaded 2 videos on knitting on 4 double point needles, a super bulky yarn weight dress for 15 to 18 inch dolls, and a DK weight dress for a Barbie doll, both done on circular needles. And size 5s were involved in the Barbie dress. So working downward with circular needles, a doll such as Madeline would be next. Now, this is one of my patterns that I have available for Madeline. And this pattern is not a tube dress because in Madeline's character story is she's 8 years old. And although, I wore sundresses or, maybe tube dresses when I was 8, it's just a little bit more appropriate to have her have a regular dress on. So my pattern is both combined circular and straight needles. But the other thing that is this size weight yarn, this is sock yarn that I used to make this dress. And the other thing that is this size yarn are socks. Now, I also, in my store on Etsy, I have a pattern for socks on circular needles. But I had that particular pattern I wrote for one circular needle with some straight needle work. And I could also do it on double points. But before I get to a video on circular socks, I wanted to explain how I did something way back in 2007. When I started knitting, I was one of the people that I got to the size of needles to make socks in double points, and I was like, this is nuts. I mean, this is confusing. Obviously I'm not at that point now, but when I was first looking into making socks, it looked foreign to me. So what I did was I developed a pattern that can be used anyone from toddler up to men for any size socks, women of course too, on straight needles. And that's what I've started here. And I want to show you some examples of those. When this pattern that I have is really one of my favorite patterns out of all the patterns I've written. Some foreign countries, cultures, knit socks flat, which is what I started to research, and then I developed it into a pattern. But what I did that was a little different was the diagramming I did with the pattern and a way of changing the size for any people. And I'm giving myself a plug here, but you can buy the one pattern and you can knit socks for anybody in the family. Now this is what some of them end up looking like. And these are for people that see circular needles and socks and run in the other direction. You can make beautiful socks on flat needles. These are my absolute favorite socks I own. And they are knit with crochet thread, and it's a very simple pattern. This is the sport height. So these are like peds or sport socks. I've also made them in hand spun wool. I have made them in regular sock yarn too. This is hand spun wool, so these are good boot socks or winter socks. And then these are a men's pair, also done in the crochet thread. and you know, we don't always worry about tucking the threads in the top. They're beautiful socks, and they're knit on flat needles. Now, just because we're talking about socks, here are the same pattern I developed for crochet. Now these are also done in thread, but you can see that when you crochet them, because of the crochet stitch itself being a heavier, almost a knotted stitch, they're very heavy. These are really good rain boot socks. You could wear these in your rain boots and you would be so comfortable. So these are a crochet tall version, and I do have that pattern in my store too. Now these are loom socks. Now I have several sock looms, and I do make socks on sock looms, but can you see the shape difference? And one problem I sometimes run into on sock looms, and the way you have to knit them, you do the leg portion, then there's a certain way to do the heel, and then you kind of take a left and do the foot portion. What that does is give a different shape to the sock. You can see that that's a very L-shaped sock, whereas the crochet sock, you see how there's a gentler angle here? And I find it's easier to get them on and off. That's just my preference. And then you see these are from a pattern from a vintage Columbia Minerva book, and these are just ribbed bed socks. But you can wear them with shoes and boots. They're very easy to knit, and you also do these on straight needles and then sew a seam. But my particular pattern, so there's bed socks by Columbia Minerva, loom socks, my pattern of crochet flat socks, and my favorite is still, even though I have a circular sock pattern, my favorite is still the flat socks. Now, I developed this pattern back in 2007. So that's quite a while ago, and it's my flat knitted socks pattern. And the reason I'm mentioning it now is because what I found out is when I'm using circular needles to knit something, I tend to keep working the item until I'm done. With the flat knitted socks, what I can do is put it down, do something else, and go back to it. It's a very easy pattern. Anyone can knit socks. Anyone can, except maybe toddlers. But the reason I did want to mention my pattern, because I'm actually proud of that pattern. It took a lot of research, and my mother, who was an expert knitter, she said, "Why would you make them like that? Get double point needles." And I was like, "But Mom, they fit better." And she was like, well, she was going to do hers in double point needles. They fit better. They fit better. The heel feels better. They're more comfortable. But again, that's my preference. But I'm bringing this up now because the gauge of the knitting of a Madeline doll dress is where I would be going if I moved down from super bulky to worsted and then down to sock yarn. This is a sock yarn. Well, to make socks, and I mixed them up a little bit here. Here are the size 5s that we just did a Barbie dress with. Then the size 4s. And sometimes size 4s can come into socks, but not all the time. These are 3s. These are 0s. Now, I use these also for Madeline knitting and for miniature doll knitting. That's a size 0. They're tiny. They're tiny. Now you would start circular socks on a size 1. Now if you compare the size 1 to the size 5s we were just using, there's a big difference. Most of the socks are, most of my patterns are knit on the size 3, but you start it with a size 1. So if you look at the size of those needles compared to those needles, and then picture making circular socks with a size 1 or a size 3, there's a big difference. And that's why I'm mentioning my flat pattern, because there are going to be people that look at size 1 or size 3 needles and just, it might feel too meticulous to really be something comfortable to do. So my pattern is written for starting on size 1s and working to size 3s. And most of the socks are knit on size 3s. Straight needles, anybody can do them. So I'm mentioning that before I do circular knitting for Madeline's gauge. The pattern, as I said, this is not simply a circular pattern. It has 2 different methods of knitting. And the pattern for her and some other patterns for her are available in my store. So if I do a video on this gauge and double point needles, I'd probably only be doing part of this outfit and not the whole thing. But you would get an idea of what it looks like to knit on very small needles in a circle. It's something to consider. Many people want to make socks, and it's small knitting. And so with all these different methods available, I mean crochet, loom, straight needle, worsted ribbing, or this is actually the same weight as Madeline's dress. And I developed these because I wanted comfortable white socks to wear all the time. These are actually off-white, but I wanted basic socks to wear all the time. So a little bit of a plug for my own patterns in my store, and I'll put the link to the flat knitted sock pattern. And what I'm going to do with Madeline, the Barbie dress pattern that I did was DK weight yarn by Lion Brand in acrylic, the Bonbons yarn, and I didn't look at my own notes really, and I bought 3 packages of that, so now I have enough to make 24 different dresses for Barbie, and I don't really know if I'm going to use them all that way. Now this is a sock weight yarn, and the Bonbons yarn by Lion Brand is a DK weight, which is almost 2 weights up, because sock weight is like a fingering weight, and then you would go to sport weight, and then you would go to DK. So what I'm going to do with a Madeline dress is see if I can, it's called over knitting, and I'm going to be using that light DK weight yarn on probably size 1 or 3 needles. I forget which size, it's probably 1s. And that's called over knitting, where you're using a yarn that is really thicker than the needle that you should be using. And I'm just going to see if it comes out too tight or if it can be used that way. Because the Bonbon yarns at about $4 a package for 8 of them, if you can make a dress for a doll out of each skein, and it's acrylic so they can go in the wash, it's much more economical than buying sock yarn. Or if you crochet, you probably have crochet thread around and you could use that. So flat knitted socks are an option. And I've had, over the years, so many positive comments on my pattern. because people that just don't want to get involved with circular knitting of socks now know that they can knit socks, and they are extremely comfortable. My circular pattern is also in the store, and I don't have any of those right here, but that's also an easy pattern to do. But what I'm doing right now, I'm also over knitting these. This is really a sport weight cotton, and I've got it on size 1s, and so I'm over knitting. The yarn is really too thick for a size 1 needle, supposedly, but this will give me a very, it's 100% cotton. Once they're washed, it'll give me a very tightly knit ribbing. It'll be very similar to these. I was saying it'll be very similar to these, which is crochet thread. So take a look at my flat knitted pattern and the description on it, and my circular sock pattern, and what I'm going to do for a video on this weight or this scale knitting will probably be using the DK weight yarn on size 1 needles. I don't know if you can see in the light how small the stitches really are. So I'm not sure the DK weight will work. I do have some sock yarn, so I may do 2 of them, like I did in the Barbie video. Make one in the DK by Lion brand and one in regular sock yarn. One thing I'd like to add, on my flat knitted pattern, which I've started here on the straight needles, 4 ounces of yarn is needed for these, and that's for the average like size 7.5 or 8 woman's foot. 4 ounces would probably cover the men's size as well, and that's why I've got the pattern that way. On my circular needle pattern, 2 things. It's 3.25 ounces. This is my favorite sock yarn, and it's Deborah Norville Serenity sock weight yarn, and this is 50% superwash merino, 25% rayon, and 25% nylon. And I have it in red, white, and blue because I knit flags, so I use it for other things, but it's a wonderful, wonderful yarn. It's available at Walmart. I think it's about $5 a skein, and you need 2 skeins for a pair of socks on circular needles with my pattern. The needles that I use, and these are available online, are Hiya Hiya. When I use one circular needle for socks, it's Hiya Hiya brand, and if you do a search on Google, their website would come up. And these, I go from, I think on these, a 1 up to a size 6. So they come in stainless steel or bamboo if you're using one circular needle. And that's what that circular pattern is written for, are those needles. Now on my Madeline pattern for this dress, it's written for either one circular needle like that or double points. You can do it either way. But I want to show you the yarn difference. The yellow is the Lion brand bonbons that I just used with size 6 and size 5 needles. The black is a fingering weight, and the red is the Deborah Norville Serenity sock weight. So those are the 3 different weights that we're talking about when we're knitting for Madeline size doll, which is 8 inches tall, and for socks. Now, the sock weight by Deborah Norville is not all that different from the acrylic by Lion Brand, even though it is thicker. And the fingering weight, this fingering weight is a vintage fingering weight. So you can see that's really thin. Then the sock yarn would be next. And this is, I just knit a project as a DK weight. But I think that it's squishy enough where I'll be able to compress it for a dress for Madeline. I'm going to be using size 1 double points. And I do have longer bamboo needles, and my size 1s in aluminum, I only have 3 needles. I lost one, so I made my own bamboo size 1s that in the next video I'll be starting a dress for Madeline with the Bonbons yarn on size 1 circular needles. And that will give you a very good idea of what it's like to knit in the round on double points with both very small needles and a very lightweight yarn. But that'll be the next video. I just wanted to mention that the sock yarn, the only sock yarn I buy now is Serenity by Deborah Norville. And when I use one circular needle for sock patterns, it's Hiya Hiya. And the reason is they're the only ones that make a 9-inch long needle. Boy Baleen 2 has 11-inch needles. And you can make my socks on the 11-inch needles. The Hiya Hiyas are a little bit tighter knitting. You're knitting a little bit shorter, so the whole project's a little bit tighter. You can do it on the Boy Baleen 2s. I don't think the Boy Baleen 2s go below size 3, which is why I generally use the Hiya Hiyas, because they go down to a size 1. So those are needles and weights of yarn for the weight of knitting that we're talking about, which is size 1, size 3 needles and very lightweight yarns for simple projects. I had said that I lost one of my aluminum size 1 needles, so I was going to use my handmade bamboo. I often make my own needles. I have a needle sizer, so I can make my own needles to the right size. But I have to mention other needles here because, you know, I've been knitting for a long time. I have knitting needles everywhere. And I do have one case that I use for most of them, and I happen to be in there looking for something else. And I want to show Knit Picks size 1s and size 3s in their Harmony rainbow wood needles. Knitter's Pride. These are supposed to be carbon in some way. And I have these in 1s and 3s. This is the set to look for if you're going to do socks. This is the Susan Bates sock set. And I actually have three sets, so I could have just opened another set to find my size 1. You get 000, 000, 0, and size 1 all in one package. It's a wonderful set to have. And then, just so you know where I'm headed, this has been about Madeline and fingering weight, socks, squishing down DK weight. I think it will work. But what I really also do is miniature knitting. This is a Heidi Yacht doll that I have about 5 patterns that I actually have to type up and put in my store. But this is a sweater I made for the Heidi Yacht doll. This is a 4-inch Heidi Yacht doll. obviously much smaller than Madeline, and for that type of knitting, we go from, in the Susan Bates sock set, the smallest they have are 000, which is right here. This is a set of 000s. I go all the way down to 50s. So 2 sizes smaller than this. And these are available. There's one woman on eBay that sells these very tiny needles. They're almost like, sewing needles. They're so thin. And she sells those on eBay. I believe she also started carrying 60s. And that, I think that's a little bit smaller than I want to go. So after Madeline and socks will be miniature knitting. I also, I do already have several patterns for miniature dolls, for the Heidiot dolls, and 1/12 scale dolls is what they are. So I'll be doing, I want to make this doll a shirt and a pair of pants, and Madeline needs some pants. So these videos, I'm trying to encourage people that they can do this. Also show them circular knitting, because when you get tiny, double points are almost a necessity, because as I said, Hiya is the only one that makes a 9-inch circular needle. And once you go smaller than that, you're dealing with double points, or you're dealing with straight needles and seams. So this looks like I will be able to use the Lion Brand bonbons for Madeline. I have to be careful of splitting, and so I'll probably use my Knit Picks needles to do the Madeline knitting, and see if I can come up with a dress in yellow, and maybe an apron in purple. And from there, I'm not sure if I'll do circular socks, because the pattern I have in the store for circular socks is pretty self-explanatory, and right now I'm working on the flat socks. So after Madeline, I may be doing a video on 1/12 scale miniature knitting. It's all fun.